All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a reminder to everyone in the crowd, please put cell phones, pagers on silent, mute, vibrate, and those at our remote sites to also put your computer microphones on silent as well. Today's presenter is Dr. George Rodgers. Dr. Rodgers earned his undergraduate degree at Dartmouth in New Hampshire before going on to receive his master's in science and Ph.D. in organic chemistry from Yale. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship in Zurich, Switzerland, before returning to the U.S. for medical school at State University of New York Upstate Medical Center, where he also completed his residency and chief residency. He joined the faculty here in Louisville in 1981 and has served in multiple different roles, including Director of the Division of Pediatric Pharmacology and Toxicology, Medical Director of the Kentucky Regional Poison Center, Director of the Division of Pediatric Critical Care, as well as Chief of the Section of International Pediatrics. He's a reviewer for multiple national publications and has written over 25 book chapters and 60 peer-reviewed articles. Today he will be speaking about climate change and human health. Dr. Rodgers.
If I were you, I'd save the applause for the end. We'll see whether you still like it. One of the advantages I told somebody earlier of getting to this stage in your life in terms of seniority is that you get to talk about the things you want to talk about. And this, I think, is a very apropos current topic. It's real. It certainly is very political at the moment, and I'm going to hopefully stay away from the politics until perhaps the very end. And I think it's something that's important for us to know. But that said, it's not anything that's likely to change your patient care today. But I hope you will enjoy this as we go through. It's going to be a quick overview. There is absolutely an immense amount of data and information in this area. It covers a wide range of subjects, and I'm going to touch on a number of those, but only superficially. I don't have any significant disclosures. I don't like heat, so I probably have a bias in favor of cold, but other than that, none. This is a quote from a publication entitled, "Unless We Act Now." It was put out by UNICEF about a year and a half ago. It's a very good review of climate change and its potential effects, particularly on children. And it is viewed at a world level as probably being one of the big public health issues of our time. It's not always viewed that way, unfortunately, in this country. It should not be a political issue. It sometimes is. It certainly is at the moment. This is a quote from Olympia Snow, who's technically a Republican, although sometimes tends to lean a little bit toward the middle, and making the point that this shouldn't be a political contested issue. This should be a human issue and a public health issue. That's what we would like to try and make it. But what do we know? Some of you, this may be redundant background information, but I want to go through to set the stage what it is that we know about climate change. And the first thing we know is that it's a fact. It's not an alternative fact. It's not a Chinese plot. It, in fact, is a fact. And I like this quote from our former president, President Obama, which was given a year before the Paris summit, but looking in anticipation of that meeting and pointing out the importance of this, not so much for those of us, particularly who are my age, but for my kids, my grandkids, my great-grandkids, the kids who are going to come, that we're going to be taking care of over the next 100 years. And I think we have to look forward with this. So, specifically, what do we know? We know that everything is getting warmer. Air, seawater, land. The data is irrefutable. It's there. We know that that's happening. We know that ice is melting. We'll show you some of the consequences of that. We know that sea levels are rising, and we can predict what some of the consequences are going to be. We know that weather patterns are changing. You're going to see some of this data. And we know that greenhouse gas levels are rising. And it's the greenhouse gases which are causing the other problems, temperature rise. How do you predict climate change? Basically, there are two ways. One is that you can go retrospectively and look at historical data. And by using things like ice cores, which is way outside my realm of understanding, you can go back actually hundreds of thousands of years. And you can extrapolate that data forward. You can also model. And we model for a lot of things. We model for a lot of things in disease, and we model in climate change. There are a lot of models. Basically, they all agree. There are subtle differences, and I'm going to show you. These are the four that you see showing up very commonly in the literature, and these are standard models that have been established as part of the climate change treaty that the United States signed in 1990. We are a signatory to that. We're not a signatory to some of the subsequent agreements, but we are to that one. And out of this have come the establishment of standardized models predicting temperature change and carbon dioxide rises in the environment. So you'll see some of these in subsequent slides. And I'll tell you, RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. Basically is looking at carbon dioxide levels projected. RCP 2.6 is very aggressive climate management, very aggressive management of greenhouse gases, much more aggressive than anything that the United States is doing. It's where the Europeans and the Asians are shooting for, but we're not even shooting for that right now. So 8.5, on the other hand, is do nothing. It's continue the way we are without making any major efforts to try and control greenhouse gases. And then there are two in between. But what you'll see in some of the data that I'll show you are projections based on these models. And they are standardized models now used all over the world. This is what carbon dioxide levels do under these four different models, just to show you. Current carbon dioxide level worldwide now is about 385 parts per million. The projection is that by 2100, if we do nothing, it's going to be over 1200 parts per million. That raises all sorts of issues, including health issues. And it's unclear how the human species will in fact thrive at those carbon dioxide levels. If we are very aggressive with climate management and can hit that Model 2.6 pathway, we may be able to keep that level in the range of 400. That's the goal. Whether we will get there or not is very, I think, problematic. These are just some headlines out of the New York Times, which I love. Just in the last years, I've been putting this talk together. Mexico City, sinking. Islands being evacuated because of rising sea levels. Flooding, water insecurity. You could do slide after slide of these. And this isn't a particularly humorous topic, but you'll see a couple of humorous slides in here. And this is one that I particularly liked. So for those of you with a religious bent. What are greenhouse gases? The biggie, I'm sorry to tell you, Charles, is carbon dioxide. Charles wanted me to get carbon out of my talk, but it's going to be tough. Nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorocarbons. There are other minor ones, but these are the biggies. How do they work? They basically form a shield in the lower atmosphere that prevents the Earth from losing heat. It's a heat shield. Energy can get through from the sun, but it can't be radiated effectively back off the Earth's surface. So, in fact, the surface of the Earth warms. What have these levels done? This is data looking at roughly the last 50 years, since 1970. The yellow is carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion, generation of electricity, automobiles, that sort of stuff. The orange is carbon dioxide from natural sources. Sitting in this room, we're all exhaling carbon dioxide. There are other natural sources of carbon dioxide. That's remained fairly stable. And you can go back much further than this. The light blue is methane. Methane comes from natural resources, decomposition of organic material. Now we're starting to see a lot of methane into the environment from oil and gas drilling and fracking, which is releasing methane. It's a concern because it is one of the gases that we're concerned about. The dark blue up here is nitrous oxide, most of which comes from combustion. And the top one, the dark one, are fluorocarbons. These are now regulated internationally by several treaties of which the U.S. is a signatory. So these are being probably fairly effectively controlled. And these are gases that have been used as refrigerants, insulating bodies for a long time. And we're gradually getting rid of them, replacing them with some other things that hopefully are somewhat less effective as greenhouse gases. The relationship between carbon dioxide, which is the dark blue line, and temperature. Pretty good correlation. The R value is very high for this. Where does carbon dioxide come from? This is worldwide data. It divides about 25, and 25% between energy production, transportation, and industry. Electricity production is the biggest. In some areas of the world, it's much bigger than the others, but worldwide, this is about what the data is. But look at the rate of growth of these. In the last 10 years, 2000 to 2010, the carbon dioxide produced from energy production, electricity primarily, has gone up almost 50%. That's an unsustainable rate of growth of carbon dioxide. We have to find alternative sources of energy. You can't keep going at this rate. We've been very effective in things like building emissions. This is heating and air conditioning. And we're very good with modern technology at insulating buildings so that the energy requirements for these are quite low. We can be successful at other things. In this state, we worry about coal. This is Department of Energy data. It's about 3 years old. These numbers are closer to being equivalent at this point. Gas is coming up and coal is going down. But for every unit of electricity produced, coal produces twice as much carbon dioxide as natural gas. And then look at the renewables. Wind, hydro, solar, nothing. It's very clear where we have to go. The rest of the world is going there. China is converting to renewable resources, part because they don't have oil. They have coal, and they're phasing it out. In this country, we're going to bring back the coal jobs, man. Just wait and see. But nobody wants to buy it. That's the problem. There's no market for it. Gas is cheaper. Gas produces less in the way of environmental contamination. And coal is not going to come back as a major industry. And I can remember Rodgers shot. When I first came to Louisville in 1981, you and I had a conversation about the great future of Kentucky because we were such a coal-rich state. And eventually coal was going to make us all wealthy. Now, it didn't quite happen, and it's not likely to happen in the future. Okay, what are the effects of carbon dioxide? We've talked about heat trapping, which is the global warming part. There's some other interesting things. Carbon dioxide affects agriculture. There's some really cool experiments I came across doing this talk where you can actually raise crops in fields in parallel plots, and you can control the carbon dioxide levels over top of those as they're growing. And if you increase carbon dioxide levels above the almost 400 parts per million we have now, the yield drops. These are grain crops, corn, wheat, rye, rice, the things that sustain us, and the nutrient value drops. So as carbon dioxide goes up, protein production and essential metal uptake in these grains diminishes. So if you can imagine in areas of the world like Africa where food is a problem anyway, as carbon dioxide levels go up, forget temperature, that has a separate effect. As carbon dioxide levels go up, crop yields are going to drop, and the value of what they produce is going to go down, the nutrient value. We're acidifying oceans. We all know that carbon dioxide is an acid. We deal with it every day in terms of respiratory function. The ocean is a big sink for carbon dioxide. It takes it up. And in that process, the ocean is becoming more acidic. That's demonstrable, measurable. The data is there. What happens? For those of you who like oysters and shellfish, they now produce small ones. They don't produce big ones anymore. The reproduction rate goes down. Reef death. For those of us like me who like to scuba dive or snorkel, we've all seen dead reefs. You want to go see the Great Barrier Reef? The prediction is you ought to do it in the next 20 years because it's dying at a pretty good clip. And that's ocean acidification. Reduced fish populations. This is important because worldwide, fish is about 70% of the animal protein that's used by humans. So when you cut fish yields in fishing areas, and West Africa is a good one where we go to Ghana, a lot of their protein comes from fish. As fish yields go down, food sources are going to go down. And that's going to accentuate with temperature change. This is acidification. Temperature does very much the same thing. Oh, some fish for those who like it, a dead reef on the right. What about health concerns? That's what we're really here to talk about. Climate affects health in a number of ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. First is heat stress, which is the most obvious. There are changing patterns in infectious diseases. Dr. Marshall's agreed not to comment on my infectious disease stuff. Food and water insecurity, air pollution. As you increase carbon dioxide levels with combustion, particularly of fossil fuels, along with that comes air pollution. So these two go in parallel. As the climate warms and as temperatures go up and as carbon dioxide levels go up, air pollutants also go up. More frequent natural disasters. All of the climate models predict changes in weather patterns. And in general, these are going to be more and bigger storms with more damage. It's going to be less rainfall most places, but that rainfall is going to be concentrated in very heavy storms. We're going to see more Atlantic storms, more Pacific storms, more storms all over the place. I'll show you a little bit of that data as we go through. Forced migration because of climate change. This is already, all of these are already happening. I'll show you examples. Increased conflicts. And we'll look at each of these. Vulnerable populations, as you might guess, children and the elderly. I'm rapidly approaching the second category, not the first. And pregnant women, particularly because of the fetus. People who are impoverished, they have very little ability to adapt. They don't have good access to medical care. They're usually living on the edge in terms of food. When something pushes, they don't do very well. Same thing with people living in marginal climates. There are areas of Africa now that are becoming uninhabitable. You can no longer grow crops. What do you get? You get starvation. Read about it on the front page of the New York Times virtually every day. Refugees and migrants, immigrants, same thing. No medical care, no resources, no ability to compensate. And people with chronic disease. And it's not an accident that in this country, virtually every subspecialty medical society is now looking at the effects of climate change on their population. And they're coming up with documents that review what those are likely to be, and they're coming up with protocols to try and mitigate it. We all know it's coming, and people are actively looking to prevent the damage. I like this slide. I'll tell you what it is basically. The top globe is where carbon dioxide is produced. That's the United States, a little bloated. The lower diagram is where the medical consequences are likely to be. Africa produces very little, but it's going to take the brunt of the health effects of climate change. And it's poverty, it's lack of resources, and it's areas that are already hot and marginal climates. We're going to do very well. We have air conditioning. We have a pretty good healthcare system. The people in the United States who are going to get hit, I'll show you down here, are the elderly as temperature goes up, heat stress. We'll show you some data on that. This is World Health Organization projections of what will happen by the middle of the century in terms of excess deaths. And this is malnutrition. These countries are basically Africa. The ones in the middle are Asia. The one over here on the left are high income, United States and Europe. So we don't get hit with malnutrition. We're not going to get hit with deaths from malaria. We're going to have more malaria, but it's not going to kill us. This is diarrheal deaths, this is dengue, and this is heat stress. We are going to get hit with excess deaths from heat stress. Okay, increased temperature. Again, the projections. Optimistically, with very aggressive intervention, limit to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. So double that for Fahrenheit, roughly. If we don't do anything, it's going to be up in the range of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. You can imagine what that's going to be like in Louisville in the summer. Where's it going to hit in the United States? Just to show you, the areas that are going to have the biggest shift are going to be in the eastern U.S., particularly the southeast. We get hit the worst in the U.S. by model predictions. And if you think this is already here, you're right. This is an interesting data point. It's length of frost-free season. So it's the difference between last frost in the spring, first frost in the fall. And this is data referring, the baseline for this is 1900, so it's 100 years. And over 100 years in the south, we now have 6% longer. You go further north, it's even greater difference. And if you go to the west coast, it's almost 20% longer. That's what's happened over the last 100 years. And that's global warming. We're increasing deserts at a fairly great rate. This is actually a slide. Any of you read Al Gore's book, An Inconvenient Truth, published in 2006? It's quite easy to read, and it's worth a read. It's pretty good stuff. And I've borrowed a few slides from him, even though they're a little bit outdated. These numbers are continuing to go up. We're creating deserts at pretty good clips. This is the Persian Gulf. None of us live in the Persian Gulf, but basically these are current temperature. This is the 4.5 model, and that's the 8.5 model. And looking by the middle of the century, the darker it gets, the hotter it gets. So you can see these areas over here that are now getting very hot. The consequences of this, you probably can't read this slide, but what this is viability. And these are, each one of these sets of bars or graphs is a city in the Persian Gulf area. When you get above the red line, it's basically uninhabitable temperatures by humans. So some of these cities like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, by the end of the century, the models predict will be uninhabitable. And they've got some pretty good sized skyscrapers in them. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen to that. But these are pretty good projections. And there are other areas of the world, including Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, where there are going to be large areas where temperature increases are going to make them essentially uninhabitable by humans. This is a heat epidemic that hit Europe in 2003. They measured excess daily deaths during this period. And the excess daily deaths during the peak were about 5,000 extras a day. This is 16 countries in Europe. Most of these were the elderly and infants. Those are the two populations that don't do well with excess heat. And if you're elderly, perhaps like myself in a few years, and you've got lung disease or heart disease, you're in deep doo-doo because you're not going to do well when the temperature goes up unless you've got a damn good air conditioner. I want to point out one thing on this slide. Forget this side. Just look at this side. This is the two top lines are the 8.5 model temperature increase over time. The difference between the dotted line and the solid line is population. If you assume that population is growing at its current rate, this is where you end up. Temperature change of 5 to 6 degrees. If you keep population stagnant at 2010 levels, almost a 50% reduction. And the point of that is that part of the driver for global warming is in fact increasing population on the globe. The more people, the more energy that's consumed, the more carbon dioxide that's produced, the more temperature rise you get. So population control is one of those things long term that has to be figured into climate control. Vector-borne diseases, Dr. Marshall. There are several reasons why climate affects vector-borne diseases. The most obvious one is that it expands the range of vectors. Vectors like mosquitoes or ticks only grow in a certain temperature range. They can only survive in a certain temperature range. As that temperature range moves north, in our case, since we're in the northern hemisphere, that range is going to increase. And there are consequences to that, obviously. It also lengthens that season, frost to frost. So you've got a longer period of time during which you may be bitten by this mosquito who's carrying malaria or this tick that's carrying Lyme disease. And finally, it also increases, and this is one I'd never thought of, to be honest, but it increases the rate of maturation of both the vector, the mosquito, the tick, and also the organism that it's carrying. That organism needs to develop within the vector before it can be transmitted. And I'll show you a slide with some of that data in just a second. This is ticks and Lyme disease. And this is basically right now, the darker blue you get, the less likely you are to have Lyme disease. If you're down here in the red zones, it's a hot zone. This is mid-century, and this is late in this century. And you can see that these lines continue to move north. The hot zone continues to expand. So the prediction is that Lyme disease, this is just one example, is going to spread further north and become more common in northern parts of the United States and even southern Canada, where it's not currently found with any frequency. This is malaria. This is the time it takes for the malaria parasite to develop in the mosquito to the point where you have a sporozoite that can be transmitted to a human. And if you look at, say, 20 degrees, if you're operating at 20 degrees, it takes 15 days for that to develop in the mosquito. If your temperature, however, is 30 degrees, it takes about 7 days. So the consequences of that are that these insects become infectious much sooner, and they are infectious for longer periods. All of these play into concerns, particularly with vector-borne diseases and climate change. This is just an example. This is what malaria is going to look like by mid-century, and most of the United States will be in a zone where it is potentially transmittable. It will probably be endemic in the southern belt across the U.S. The same thing is true for a number of other diseases, including dengue, chikungunya. Food security. 4 things that go into food security. Is it available? Is there enough of it? Can you get it? Is it accessible in terms of transportation and in terms of finances? Can your body utilize it? If you're malnourished, it may not be able to utilize it. And finally, is the supply stable? And that implies, among other things, some political security. This is a projection right now. It's estimated that there's somewhere between 33 and 35 million malnourished kids in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2050, the estimate is, even without climate change, it's going to be 40-something And with climate change, the estimate is up in the 50s. That's because of food insecurity. Areas are no longer going to be able to produce sufficient food. There are going to be shortages because of limited fish supplies. There are going to be limited nutritional value in what is grown. So a whole variety of things that go into food security. But it's there now, and it's going to get worse. Water security, we don't think of much anymore. We turn on the tap, you have clean water. There are a number of things that play into water security. Drought is probably the most obvious one, but flooding and contamination of water systems is also important. And remember, part of the climate model scenario is that we're going to have less rain most of the time, and when it does come, it's going to come in big downpours, which lead to flooding. We're already seeing that worldwide, and I'll show you some of that data. And with flooding comes water contamination, bacterial, chemical from industrial runoff. Rising sea levels. This is already happening in Florida. If you live along the coast and you get your water from an aquifer, the salt water, as the sea rises and we drain aquifers, the salt water is now moving into those aquifers, which increases the salinity. That has a couple of effects, and we're seeing it. Probably the biggest example of this is Bangladesh, where most of the country is less than 3 meters above sea level. And a lot of it is now being flooded with rising sea levels. Their aquifers are already contaminated with arsenic, and now they're becoming contaminated with salt. And with salt, unfortunately, comes things like hypertension, which is becoming a public health problem for them. So this is something that's going to be very real in some areas of the world and is already there. This is a picture out of the New York Times again about a month ago. This is Santiago, Chile. Big flooding, city water system contaminated, people standing in mile-long lines to get fresh water. So it's going to happen. Air pollution. This is Beijing. Anybody been to Beijing? It's a mess. India's getting there. The Chinese, now in some very nice papers that were published in the last year or two, have really been looking at the development of smog. And it turns out that smog requires air pollutants, particularly small particle air pollutants, and it requires temperature change. So for them, climate change is one of the direct causes of their smog and air pollution problems. They recognize it. They're phasing out coal as a power source, among other things. They are now way ahead of us in terms of renewable energy sources, particularly solar, but a big problem worldwide. The contaminants we're worried about everywhere: ozone, small particles, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide. And I'll show you an interesting story about SO2 a little bit later. This slide looks at air pollution deaths worldwide and how many of them could be, these percentages, or how many could be prevented if you could just control the small particle air pollution. A lot of that comes from diesel engines. It's the little carbon particles that 2.5 micron and less that get way down into your lungs. And the estimates are in Asia that you could get rid of almost half of the air pollution related deaths if you could control that. And people are trying to control it. Wildfires. With climate change, we're going to have more desertification. We're going to have more dry areas. Fires are already becoming more common, including big ones. Anybody remember the one in Malaysia about 5 years back that basically polluted the world? We were getting air pollution here from forest fires in Asia. Those are going to become more common and a significant source of air pollution. These are major forest fires in the Americas. Again, this is a slide from Al Gore's book, but those numbers also continue to rise. And you don't have to read very far in the papers to find them. This is emergency room visits for children in New York City related to ozone. and they broke it into heptiles for some reason, and they broke it into age. But just look down here, for instance, and you can see the more ozone, the sixes, the more increased risk for ER visits for asthma. We've seen that here. There are a number of papers that have looked at things similar to this. And air pollution clearly triggers acute asthma. It's probably also a cause of asthma. If you want to travel with a no footprint, this is 1 passenger mile in a car, and you produce 250 grams of carbon dioxide, 25 or 50 milligrams of small particle air pollution. You can do a little bit better in a bus, but if you want to walk or ride your bike, you can get it down to 0 for those who are into that sort of thing. Severe weather, temperature increases, heat waves, decreased precipitation we've talked about, increase in heavy events, an increased frequency of severe storms. This is heavy rainfall events in the United States over the last 50 years. And you notice in the southeast where we are, they have increased by almost 30%. If you go further north, it's even worse. These are the events that are greater than what you would have expected 1% of the time. So major dumps. And some of us can probably remember those. I get flooded in occasionally at home. This is the projection on what's going to happen with the two models. If we don't do anything, these events are going to go up by about a factor of 5. If we are lucky and control things effectively, we may keep it increased to a factor of 2. Flooding events worldwide. Look at the pattern again. I'm not going to focus on the numbers. Going up with time, and this is the last 50 or 60 years. So we are seeing more of these events worldwide. This is power in North Atlantic storms, hurricanes. Not numbers, it's a power quotient that the weather people use. And over the last 40 years roughly, the power of these storms every year keeps going up. So we're getting things like Sandy hitting New York. And we're going to see more of these. Not necessarily more storms, but the ones that come are going to be more powerful. And in part that's simple because these storms derive their energy from heat. Most of our hurricanes start off the west coast of Africa, and they move across the southern Atlantic and then move up. And the heat comes from the water, and the heat then in terms of perpetuating the storm, comes from air temperature. So as water temperature rises, air temperature rises, there's more energy available for these storms to pick up. So it's fairly intuitive that that's going to happen. Sea level rise. Sea level rise comes from ice, basically, ice melting somewhere. This is pack ice. You'll notice a little polar bear down there. I think there's another one over there. If you like polar bears, go see them soon because they're destined for extinction. This is sea ice in the northern hemisphere, and it's gone down about 15% in the last 100 years. And it's continuing to drop at an accelerated rate. What does that matter? This is where ice melt comes from: glaciers, Antarctic ice sheet, Greenland ice sheet, which is bigger than Antarctic. And for every 100 gigatons, it's a number you want to remember. You can throw this out on rounds. For every 100 gigatons of ice that melt, you raise sea level by 1/3 of a millimeter. And you can do those calculations and predict how fast sea levels are likely to rise and how far. That's Columbia Glacier in Alaska. When Tanya and I were there, we were up in here somewhere. This is over the last 40 years or so. So if you want to see glaciers, go now. Anybody seen the glacier on Kilimanjaro? It's going to be gone in 10 years. So if you want to see the glacier on the top of Kilimanjaro, go now. Glaciers all over the world are disappearing at a very rapid rate. This is Bangladesh, and this is sea level rise. The estimate is it'll take somewhere between 15 and 20% of the country by the time it reaches its maximum, the end of this century. It's already infiltrating water supplies. It's already taking land. And this area in Southeast Asia is very low. And most of these countries, Vietnam, Thailand, the whole collection around the coast, are very susceptible to sea level rise. But it's not just there. Any of you guys own property in North America on the seashore? One. Well, you may want to think about getting rid of it. This is an article in the New York Times earlier this year looking at property values along our coast. And the property values now correlate pretty well with what the projected sea level rise and storm surge effects are for areas along the coast. And some of them, projections are going to get hit very hard in the next 50 years. So the property values there are going down. The ones where the ground's a little bit higher, storm surge may not get them, is going up. So it's affecting us as well. There are 500 million kids who live in areas that are flood prone. And most of them have other risk factors: poor sanitation, poor access to food, poor access to health. So it's not just the flood zone, it's other things that go along with it. Same thing with drought. If you've been to Africa, you've seen drought with us in Ghana. And seeing people with buckets of water is not unusual. Trying to fish water out of a dry well. Almost 200 million kids are estimated to live in drought-prone areas. Most of them sub-Saharan Africa, but there are others. And just like with flood zones, these kids have other risk factors as well. Poor sanitation, poor food access. It's not just drought. It's other things as well that magnify the effects. You know, we think of the Farm Belt as being very red states, and many of them very much opposed to climate change things. But I'll tell you, the farmers have caught on. Climate change is real. It's affecting them. And the agriculture community in this country is actively working on development of heat-resistant crops, drought-resistant crops, new tilling methods that use less water because it's becoming scarce. So it's real, and groups are recognizing this. Forced migration. What causes it? Sea level rise in some areas, flooding in others, drought, areas that are becoming uninhabitable, and civil unrest that's triggered by some of the climate change related effects. This is a sobering estimate. It's from a pretty reliable group that estimates by the middle of this century we could have as many as 200 million climate refugees. A huge number. But look, we already have them. Jerry's not here today, but this is just south of New Orleans, the Isle Jean-Charles. This island's been inhabited for 200 years, now being evacuated because it's now underwater, and people have to move out. That's what it looked like 20 years ago. This is what it looks like now. So the EPA is, in fact, evacuating this island, moving the population who've been there for 200 years to another island. This is Alaska, north coast of Alaska. Same thing. Sea level rise and storm surge from increasingly powerful storms are wiping out island and coastal communities. They're having to be moved inland. This is our country. These are island countries in the Pacific, like the Marshall Islands. These islands in 50 years are going to be underwater. They are shallow atolls, coral atolls. Most of them don't have a height of more than a couple of meters. With sea level rise, they are now being overrun. And the UN is working with the governments in these countries to try and decide what to do with these people. These are whole countries that are going to be gone. This is Marshall Islands. This was a cemetery 20 years ago. This is what it looks like now. It's underwater. Airports in some of these countries now you can't fly into because they're underwater. This is a a piece of sculpture from Berlin. It's done by European sculptor Isaac Cordal. If any of you are artists, I apologize, but I like this one. These are all clay figures, and this is a collection of guys in suits sitting around talking as the water is now approaching their heads. And I think that's what we're seeing politically in this country right now, unfortunately. Civil unrest. The Pentagon has known about this for decades. Pentagon, actually, the military in this country is very climate sensitive. They've been preparing their own bases and facilities, and they understand that climate is a trigger for events around the world in which they may become involved. They call it a threat multiplier. And it's well recognized by not only our military, but others. What triggers conflicts? Water and food shortages, decreased arable lands, recession, government's inability to provide services. Here are three current ones that are in part related to climate. We hear a lot about Darfur. It's like our old West. In part, it's a battle over limited water resources. Who gets it, the cattle growers or the farmers? Sounds like an old Western. Arab Spring. One of the triggers for the Arab Spring was food shortages, primarily wheat, which was a staple crop. Wheat supplies were low because of temperature rise and climate change. Mali is another one, just north of Ghana in Africa, where we have decreased arable lands. What about mitigation? What can we do? Whoops, wrong way. First, three definitions. Prevention, we're too late. Climate change is already here. We can't prevent it. We can mitigate it. We can do things to minimize it and its effects, and we can hope that we have some adaptation. We don't know very much about adaptation. There's a slide I was going to show you, but don't have time for, that showed a little bit about that. But, whoops, wrong way again. Yep. Okay, what can we do? We can reduce fossil fuel consumption, lower carbon dioxide. People are looking at ways to capture and store carbon dioxide underground. Whether these are economically or technically feasible, I think is unknown at this point, but it's being tried. Our two big capture and storage sites now are the ocean and rainforests. And we're diminishing the rainforests, and the ocean is already showing the effects. So we probably need to find something else. This is people's opinion about President Obama's cap on coal emissions. And overall, 70% thought it was a good idea. We got rid of it this week, if you listen to the news. Kentucky was a little bit less favorable, but still more than 50%. So people recognize, if you ask them, the needs to do some of these things. There are friendly energy sources, obviously. Wind, solar. My house is heated by geothermal. Nuclear, which we haven't developed in this country at all for the last 30 or 40 years. And finally, hydropower, also which we have not done anything with in this country for a long time. Anybody know any of these people? Probably not. None of them are medical. This is an interesting story I told you I would tell you. This is cap and trade. And cap and trade is a system that came in the United States finally in 1990 with the Clean Air Act to limit sulfur dioxide. Any of you who are old enough remember acid rain. Acid rain used to chew up the finish on your car. It ruined the fishing in some lakes that I used to fish in New England, and we've gotten rid of it. We got rid of it by cap and trade policy, which basically gives to industry the right to sell their rights to pollute. You can regulate with that system the total amount of SO2 that you think is acceptable, but then within that, the industries that produce can either clean up their act and sell their rights to pollute, or they can continue to pollute. And that's been very effective at lowering sulfur dioxide levels, particularly from coal-fired power plants. It's been proposed that we do a carbon cap and trade. And in fact, much of the rest of the world already does. The Congress in the United States has uniformly refused to consider it. So we don't have it. But this is an interesting story if any of you want to read it. It starts back in the 1880s when we started to realize that there are unintended consequences from industrial acts. So somebody burns fuel, they generate electricity, which makes some people happy, but the air pollution makes somebody else happy, and they're a passive bystander. That those people should have some rights in the system. And that developed down through the model for cap and trade. Interesting story. Any of you know the 100 Resilient Cities program? Louisville is one. It was just announced about a month and a half ago. We are one of 100 cities in the country. This is being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and about 100 other NGOs and large corporations to try and make cities resilient in terms of social structure and environment. And in Louisville turns out, some of the other ones, Accra and Quito happen to be two other ones, places where we work, but a lot of other big cities that you would recognize. Louisville happens to be an urban heat island. We are one of the cities in the country where city temperatures are rising the fastest, partly because we've lost a lot of tree canopy, other reasons as well. And Louisville now, as part of this grant, has a contract with Georgia Tech, instead of U of L or UK, I don't know why, to develop mitigation strategies. We're also a city that's prone to flooding, severe storms, and we've had poor air quality for decades. So those are also being looked at as part of this program. Let's skip that one. This is a group that grades states in terms of their preparedness for climate and other disasters. Not surprisingly, we're in the lower 10%, not the upper 10%. But there are worse states. So what are the barriers to effective mitigation for climate change? Probably the biggest one is political. Number one, understanding, and then the will to do something. Denial comes into the picture. Resource limitation, both money and technology. And technology development, from basic research through translational research to make these things real and effective. My second cartoon of the day. Any of you recognize anyone in here, please keep it to yourself. I could probably put a number of politicians into that cartoon. A quote from Mark Twain, "The Nile ain't just a river in Egypt." And some quotes from POTUS, who was kind enough to provide some quotes for this talk. Climate change is a disaster, and we're going to make America cool again. It's going to be tremendous, folks. Unfortunately, those came out of your dreams. This is the quote of the day in the New York Times last week, which is somewhat different. As to climate change, I think the president's been fairly straightforward. We're not spending money on that anymore. And if you listen to the news, the last week we, in fact, are defunding things through the EPA. It's going in the wrong direction. It's climate change, and it's the carbon dioxide, stupid. That's it. It's fossil fuels and carbon dioxide. And that's what we've got to work on. And if this works, yeah, I need technical help. Where's my technical help, Greg? I have a... here's the slide.
It's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming. It's freezing.
The most criticized scene in the movie An Inconvenient Truth was showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would flood the 9/11 memorial site. And people said, what a terrible exaggeration.
Hurricane Sandy slammed into New York City last night, flooding the World Trade Center site.
Storms get stronger and more destructive. Watch the water splash off the city. This is global warming.
I feel so scared. Sorry.
Despair can be paralyzing, but this to me is the most exciting new development. We're seeing a tremendous amount of positive change. The basis is there, but it's still not enough.
It's crunch time at the climate change conference in Paris.
Still some really tough negotiations going on.
What would it take to shift to renewables? I'm talking about breaking the impasse. Virtually every nation in our world agreed. Zero greenhouse emissions. It is unprecedented.
It's time to put America first. That includes a promise to cancel billions in climate change spending. Our plan will end the EPA.
The next generation would be justified in looking back at us and asking, what were you thinking? Couldn't you hear what the scientists were saying? Couldn't you hear what Mother Nature was screaming at you? This movement is in the tradition of every great movement that has advanced humankind.
We're not going to recognize it. We don't want to discuss it.
It is right to save humanity. It is wrong to pollute this earth. It is right to give hope to the future generations. Don't let anybody tell you that we're going to get on rocket ships and live on Mars. This is our home.
This is a trailer that came out 2 days ago for a new movie that's coming out in July, a sequel by Gore. And I'm not publicizing Gore, but I thought it made some good points. And I think this really is an issue that belongs to all of us. It's going to affect our future progeny, and I think we need to be cognizant of it and to speak up. And it's time to quit. Any questions?
George, thanks. You officially scared everything out of me. I want to put in one.
Just leave it there on the chair, Clint.
Awesome. Thanks for all that. I have one quick just a little shout out. On April 15th, there is 2017 Urban Tree Symposium at U of L, and they are giving away up to 3 trees per resident. It's from 4 to 6 p.m. at Ernst Hall. They've had 3 of these different things where the city's trying to help rebuild the canopy in the city, and so if you want to plant some trees, there's some free trees on the 15th. That's the third and final of those little installments.
Also going to be a March for Science on the 22nd, and there's supposed to be something in Louisville, although I don't know exactly what it's going to be. 23rd? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think this is a period where some of us need to start becoming a little bit more actively engaged than I know I personally have not. And perhaps I'm atypical because I'm old enough to have a little bit of time. But I think it's important for our kids to be involved, for our families to be involved, because these are things that are going to affect all of us.
George, as a matter of importance to each of us, it came as a shock to me to realize that 85% of our oxygen is produced by the oceans and not by green plants. If we're cutting down our rainforests at the rate we are now, and we're acidifying the ocean and the reefs are dying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what will happen to the unicellular, quote, vegetables out there in the ocean producing that oxygen? And the answer is, I don't know, and I don't want to even think about it. But do you have any feeling?
I don't know the answer to that either. There's a huge amount of research being done in this area. What's being done in the U.S. is likely to terminate at this point, unfortunately. But even worldwide, there are other places. The Chinese are hugely active in this area, among others. And people are looking at algae. They're looking at other plant forms in the ocean and the effects of pH change, temperature change, and surface carbon dioxide, not just what's dissolved, but it's what's above the ocean as well. So a lot of interesting and good science will come out of this. Thank you all.